Hello and welcome to the Motivational Midwife. My name's Lynn Jones and this series of videos is looking at helping you make the link between A&P and what you actually see in practice. So today's video is the kidneys. Let's have a look at trying to put it all together. So what's the urinary system made up of? Well, you've got your two kidneys in most people. Some people only have one, but most people have two kidneys and one sits slightly higher than the other. And you've got two ureters connecting the kidneys to the bladder. And the ureters are muscular tubes that come from the kidneys down to the bladder. And the top part of the ureter is slightly thicker and more bulbous, and that's called the pelvis. And you've got the bladder, and you've then got your urethra, which is your tube going from the bladder to the outside world. And most people will think of the kidney's main function as producing urine, and indeed it is, but it has many, many other functions. So it regulates your water balance and your acid-base balance. And if you may or may not remember that for cells to function optimally, they need to have a pH really within quite a tight window. 7.35 to 7.45 for adults is the acid-base balance that we're looking for. So acid means that the blood becomes acidic, and base is another word used for alkaline. And it excretes metabolic and nitrogenous waste, so things like urea, creatinine, uric acid, they're excreted, and you look for some of those things in some conditions, and we'll talk about that slightly later. It also is responsible for some hormone secretion, so things like erythropoietin, renin, prostaglandins, and there are some other very long named hormones that are secreted by the kidneys as well. It's involved in removing toxic chemicals, so things like food additives, drugs, chemicals generally. It's involved in regulating the blood pressure, and that's via the renin-angiotensin system, which we'll look at in a different session. Control of red blood cell production, and that's where the erythropoietin comes in, the hormone secretion. Vitamin D activation and calcium balance, and then gluconeogenesis. So that's the formation of glucose from amino acids and other precursors if the body is lacking energy. So the kidneys actually receive 25% of the cardiac output. So that's a lot of blood goes to the kidneys, and that's 8 times more than muscles get if you were exercising heavily. So it's a lot of blood goes there. So there's, a lot of blood being filtered. Each kidney has about 1 million nephrons, and there's 2 types of nephrons. You've got cortical nephrons, which have got a short loop of Henle, and that's the loop of Henle is the big long tube that goes down and back up again to the capsule, and that is really, the short ones are more about plasma volume control. And then you've got the long ones, the juxtamedullary ones, which are longer, and they extend to the renal medulla. And they are really more involved about increased water retention. So if people are dehydrated, these would definitely kick in because they're trying to keep water in the body. And then you've got your Bowman's capsule. So, okay, which is a little bit like a ball, and it's very vascular. So there's a lot of capillary vessels there, and substances can leave via the Bowman's capsule capillaries. And so you need the blood pressure within that area, within the capillary area, to be a constant, so that you get a constant rate of filtration. So you don't really want that blood pressure in the capsule fluctuating too much, because it keeps that filtration rate steady. So there's 3 steps in urine production. We've got filtration, reabsorption and secretion. So let's look at filtration. So it's a non-selective passive process, so it just kind of happens. The walls of the glomerulus, so we're in that capsule, they are semi-permeable. So that means that some things can pass through, but some things won't. And so if we've got things with a low molecular mass, they are forced out because the blood pressure is staying constant in that capsule. It forces them out into the Bowman's capsule. So things like water, glucose, amino acids, vitamins will enter the nephron and then be excreted. And blood cells and plasma proteins, they're large molecules, so they stay put, they stay in the blood. So remember, we've said 25% of the cardiac output's going to the kidneys, and it's being filtered. So blood cells and plasma proteins and all these big molecules stay put in the blood and go back off on their merry way. But water and glucose and things like that will be filtered out. So when we've got high blood pressure in pregnancy, what happens is it disrupts this renal function, and you will see protein in the urine. And protein is a large molecule, so normally it wouldn't pass into the urine, but it is forced into the bloodstream. Okay, so the Bowman's capsule, rather, it's forced into that Bowman's capsule. So this happens because the blood pressure is higher, so we get an abnormal ultrafiltration. Okay, so people with, the blood pressure in that Bowman's capsule is higher, and therefore it forces those larger molecules out of the Bowman's capsule, which would normally be maintained in the bloodstream. People who've already got some existing renal impairment, they don't make that adaptation to the physiological changes happen. So remember, in pregnancy, we've got increased circulating volume. There's all sorts of other changes that are going on to the cardiovascular system. And they don't make that change quite as well as someone who hasn't got a problem. If the blood pressure is raised in early pregnancy, of course, this is going to create more problems. And these people who've got a raised blood pressure in early pregnancy don't make that physiological reduction in the second trimester that you would normally have, because of the effects of progesterone and other changes. In the second trimester, you would normally get a physiological lowering of the blood pressure. And that doesn't happen with people who have blood pressure that's already raised in pregnancy. And of course, this puts increased risks to both the mother and the fetus. So looking at selective reabsorption, the lining of the nephron, it has loads of epithelial cells. And within that, it's also got a lot of mitochondria. And the mitochondria provide the energy to facilitate that active transportation, because most of the reabsorption actually happens in the proximal convoluted tubule of the nephron, because that's the widest and longest part of the nephron. So things like glucose and amino acids get totally absorbed, and they're not normally present in the urine. However, having said that, if you think about your diabetics or your gestational diabetics, then we very often pick glucose up in the urine, and that will be because the glucose levels in the bloodstream have exceeded what the transporter proteins can actually cope with, and so that excess spills over into the urine. Hormones then really have a part to play in regulating a lot of the other processes. So antidiuretic hormone will have an effect on water retention. So the more water the body is keeping for itself, the more concentrated the urine will be, or the less urine production you'll have as well. So think of women who are very unwell or have lost a large amount of blood. Very often you will notice that the urine production is reduced. Calcitonin increases calcium excretion, and then the opposite of that, if we don't want loads being excreted, parathyroid hormone will rebalance that by absorbing the calcium. And aldosterone, which is has a part to play in sodium reabsorption. If you remember, water goes with salt, so wherever salt is going, water will follow it. So they are all very, very closely linked. And then I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, but it's ANP. It inhibits, so it stops that sodium reabsorption. And ANP also increases that filtration rate, that glomerular filtration rate, so it will increase sodium excretion. So then moving on to the secretion part, as I say, some waste products are actively transported via the capillaries to the tubules. So you've got hydrogen and potassium ions, creatinine. So think when we send with our ladies that we are thinking they might have hypertension or PET protocols, things like that, we're often sending a urine sample off to look at the protein creatinine ratio. And this is what we're looking at. And so your normal limit would be sort of 30 milligrams per millimole or less would be normal. Toxins, as we've said, and drugs. So some of the drugs that we give women, they're going to be excreted via the urinary system. And say cells of the tubule actually synthesize some of these, so ammonia ions and peptides. So looking at the urethra, that's a short tube that joins the bladder to the outside world. We've got an increased risk of urinary tract infections, particularly us as women, because the location of our urethra is much closer to the rectum and much more likely to pick up various bugs. Mucus secreting glands that are inside the urethra, they help protect it because urine can be quite corrosive in nature. But also any trauma to the pelvic floor can cause neurological damage, internal sphincter dysfunction. So women will get that sense of urgency needing to pass urine a lot more frequently. So let's look at urinary tract infection. So why is it an issue for pregnancy? Well, we've got progesterone. We've already said that the bladder, the ureters, the urethra, they're all smooth muscle, and progesterone, as we know, relaxes smooth muscle. So you're more likely to get stasis of urine, so urine just sitting there. And that gives a lovely medium for bacteria to grow. And when we're looking at dipstick in the urine, if we've got a urinary tract infection, we've got protein, nitrates, blood and leukocytes usually showing up in that. And so what has happened is those epithelial cells that are lining have become damaged, and that sets up an inflammatory response, and that will make the vessels more leaky, and so those larger molecules like protein molecules and blood molecules that normally would stay put escape into the urine so we can see it. Catheterization, which happens a lot, more than you'd think in maternity. Every time we use a urinary catheter, we are increasing the risks of urinary tract infection. And I believe the last figures out there show that 65%, I believe it is, of hospital-acquired urinary tract infections are to do with insertion of the catheter. Okay, so it's why it's key that you use your aseptic technique when you are using, if you're having to put a catheter, urinary catheter in for any reason, even if it's just an in and out, not a Foley's indwelling catheter. And there you have it. I hope that's been helpful in helping you sort of join the dots up a little bit for some of the things we see in maternity physiologically and what's actually happening in the body. If you can help join those dots up, sometimes it will help you make sense of why we do the things we do and why we offer the treatments we do. So I look forward to seeing you next time. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so, and also look out for us on Facebook at The Motivational Midwife.